This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jenny Ifft, K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist, begins today's show with information about the Farm Bill and agriculture policy in the 1990s. Decoupled payments is one thing that took place during this time, and Jenny describes what they are and their impact. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth continues today's show as he discusses household pests. He shares information and control methods for Japanese beetles and brown recluse spiders. Rounding out today's show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses price variation of a gallon of homogenized milk for both consumers and dairy farmers in the Central Milk Marketing Order. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start this Tuesday show, as we have been in the past, with some Farm Bill information. And as we work our way forward into history, we're now in the 90s, and as always, to share information during that time period, we're joined with K-State Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us once again.
Great to be here.
And so, starting with the 90s, before we really get into it, what was it like coming into this time period?
Well, you had just decades of lots of social change. You can go back to the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, massive social change. You had millions of families moving from small farms in rural areas to towns and urban areas. You know, the 70s, there was new trade. There was a lot of optimism in agriculture. Some of that led to the high leverage on some farms that contributed to the farm crisis of the 80s and a lot of, turmoil during that time. So, there was a lot going on there's a lot happened that you need to take into account when you think about what happened in the 90s.
When we enter into the 90s and now talking about farm policy, as we usually do during a certain time period, why was that difficult to change in the 90s?
Well, going into the 90s, farm policy was still rooted in that Depression-era policy of price supports, which had led to an oversupply of commodities and taken decades. There's been decades of trying to change this in Congress. And a lot of major policies, passed in previous decades. You can think of nutrition assistance, food stamps, conservation policy like the Conservation Reserve Program. They were considered important in themselves for, their own objectives, but also that they could play some role in managing this oversupply of commodities. And you had a lot of presidents who expressed that they wanted to get agriculture to be more market-driven or to get the government out of agriculture. Eisenhower expressed these sentiments, Reagan. But really two reasons why this didn't happen. First, the politics, were very tough. There were a lot of groups that benefited from these high prices. There was a regional aspect to this political economy, but politically it was difficult because some groups did benefit in some parts of the U.S. Also, you had periods of economic stress and suffering. If you think back to the farm crisis in the 1980s, when there was a lot of farms being foreclosed on and that depression in rural areas.
And so what caused things to change in the early 90s?
Well, there was a couple things. I would say the two major factors were that the Republicans were in control of both houses of Congress. You had high commodity prices. Also, Bill Clinton was president, who was arguably or could be considered a moderate and open to reform.
Something then also, as you mentioned, is Pat Roberts had some ideas, and obviously Pat Roberts was from Kansas.
Yes, and he played a lot of leadership during that time. He was chair of the House Ag Committee, and in late 1995, he had put some reforms in a budget reconciliation package. So this wasn't in a standalone farm bill. But what this did was it got rid of target prices. It kept some of the marketing loan programs and also sort of set aside and acreage reductions were removed. It also introduced something that is referred to as decoupled payments.
And so what are decoupled payments?
Yeah, it's not a term that is commonly used. When we talk about decoupled payments, the idea is that if they're truly decoupled, they're not going to change with market conditions. So that's one part of it. The other part is eligibility isn't based on the production decisions you make today. So the idea was there could be support for agriculture, but it wasn't tied to the market and hopefully wouldn't lead to an oversupply of commodities. One of the ways they were able to do this was by tying these payments to base acres or historic production.
Was this something that passed on the first attempt?
Well, like a lot of legislation, no. The bill did pass, the budget bill did pass the House in October of 1985, and it was vetoed by Clinton in December for reasons largely not related to the Farm Bill. So what they did is they introduced was the FAIR Act, Freedom to Farm is what it's known as, but it was introduced as a standalone bill in early 1996 and passed by April.
And so did that have an impact then on agriculture?
Definitely. It was a big change. So like I said, it got rid of any acreage reductions or set aside. The farm-owned reserve was put away. Also some important changes to crop insurance. So crop insurance, catastrophic coverage had been made mandatory. They took that away. Also, they said the FSA, Farm Service Agency, wasn't allowed to sell crop insurance. So it all switched to being sold by private companies at that time.
And during this time period, were there policies that were created and then sustained moving forward?
Well, a lot of them ultimately ended up not being sustained or taken out or changed in the 2002 Farm Bill. Although this bill had a lot of popular support at the time, what happened was you had the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. Commodity prices crashed. So between 1998 and 2001, you had $21 billion of ad hoc payments. It was a big number at the time. It's still a big number today. But if you put in context, from 1999 to 2001, government payments were about 40% of farm income.
And government payments, something important for Kansas.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's well known that sort of there were these ad hoc payments in the late 90s due to low commodity prices. But I didn't really deeply understand this till I looked at farm income in Kansas during those years. And if you look at 2002, 2001, and 2002, farm income was negative or barely positive for the entire state. Obviously, could have been different from farm to farm. But, if you think about this, without government payments, farms couldn't cover their expenses during this time period. Let alone anything left over for the, family income, returns to the operator, money to repay debt. It was, it was stressful. And as I've talked about this across the state, people remember how stressful this time was and how bad the financial situation was. So those ad hoc payments during that period really averted another farm crisis in Kansas and other states.
We're at a time period now where many producers who are still producing possibly were alive during that time period and working in agriculture industry.
Yeah, producers, lenders, a lot of people remember it.
And with these changes that thankfully allowed us to avert another farm crisis, was there pressure being felt to now change things?
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at, we'll talk about the 2002 and other farm bills moving forward. Some elements of it were kept, but there was definitely some pressure to change things based on what was sort of the lower prices and low farm incomes during that time.
And Jenny, there were some big legacy points from the 90s that it could be beneficial for people and producers to remember.
Yeah, and this is definitely an important period, and there was a lot of reforms during this time. Really, so 4 points I want to make about the legacy. First, it largely got the government out of supply management. So, and there's two elements of this. So, got the government more or less out of the commodity storage business. So, the government's largely not storing and selling grain or other commodities with a few exceptions. It also got the government out of restricting production. So, policies like set aside, acreage reduction, sort of any, where any eligibility for safety net payments is tied to reducing production, that just doesn't happen anymore. So that was a sort of a lasting legacy of what happened during this time. And it's this took 6 decades, and decades of people sort of pushing towards this as well. It wasn't like people suddenly realized this was a problem in the 90s. People had realized it decades before, but it took a long time. Another subtle point is base acres. So base acres were introduced in the 80s. We talked about this idea of decoupling. And one lasting legacy is sort of the role of base acres in farm policy. So any standing commodity programs, Title I for any farm policy nerds out there, those base acres are tied to historic production. So your eligibility for safety net payments isn't tied to the production decisions you make today. And again, historically you had this problem of oversupply, distortions in markets, really leading to some intractable problems. Base acres are a large part of the solution to that. And today they're widely supported. The importance of them is understood. Most commodity groups support continuing to use base acres forest standing programs. Number 3 is crop insurance. Crop insurance by the late 1990s, and there was some legislation that we'll talk about later, but crop insurance gained a lot of support during this period. It was expanded. It received more government support. Today, it's a popular and widely used safety net. And a lot of the changes in the mid and late 90s were a reason for that. It is important to emphasize, however, though, that none of these reforms got the government out of agriculture. The government still plays a large role, especially during low-income years, whether it's, the COVID pandemic, the trade wars. We're looking at extended drought conditions as well now.
So seeing a continuation into 2000s of the government still being involved in agriculture?
Definitely, but not through supply management.
Jenny, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again and discuss agriculture policy and the Farm Bill as it relates to the 90s.
Great to be here.
That was Kansas State University Agriculture Policy Specialist and Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft, with more information about agriculture policy and the Farm Bill, however, this time talking about the 90s. If you'd like to learn more about agriculture policy and the Farm Bill, you can do so by going to agtoday.net and searching for Farm Bill in the top right-hand search bar. We're about to cut to a short break now, and when we return from it, we're going to be joined by Key State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth as he discusses household pests. He specifically focuses on brown recluse spiders and Japanese beetles. We're cutting to that break now, and we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now with a conversation about some bugs you might be seeing near your home or in your home. And then to talk about them, we have K-State Extension crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
Starting off with a Japanese beetle.
The Japanese beetles have been a serious problem in the eastern part of the United States, and what I used to call the I states, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, etc. And they have been slowly over the last 20 years moving west. And they went through Missouri, and now they're probably 3/4 of the way through the state of Kansas. And by that I mean as far as populations are building up enough where they cause a problem. A lot of folks still aren't aware of the situation. They don't know exactly what they look like or what they do or how to control them. They're just now becoming adults in Kansas, at least for the last week or so. They first become adults in the eastern part of the state, and I've heard just recently they've been spraying some cornfields for Japanese beetles, and they are slowly moving west. We just started finding some in Riley County and Gary County in the last couple of days. A couple of years ago, there were some serious populations up in Smith and Republic counties, so it is becoming a problem all across the state. The Japanese beetle generally has been considered more of a pest on home lawns and gardens type stuff. The adult will feed on anything. The adult beetle is often mistaken for a June beetle. It's about the same size as a June bug or June beetle, but they're very distinctive. They're kind of a coppery green color, but the distinctive part is the little white tufts of hair on each side, each lateral side of their body, and that's really characteristic of the adult June beetle. In agriculture, we worry about them for two different reasons. Number one, the adults, it depends on when they emerge as adults and where the crops are in their development. But first of all, they'll go to corn silks. They're very attracted to corn silks, but they have to be green. Once they turn brown, they won't bother them, and they've already pollinated anyway. But the growers right now have been spraying because they're worried that they may take enough silks off the ears that they won't pollinate. I have a real problem with that. We've done that for many, many years. It takes a lot of very voracious insects eating on those silks to keep them bruned back enough so that it doesn't accept the pollen and it's not pollinated. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's what they go for in corn. They go for the silks. And if the silks are brown or there isn't any corn around, they'll go to soybeans. And in soybeans, they can defoliate pretty quickly. They like the most succulent green, tender leaves, and they will feed on those leaves. The thing is, the soybean plant's really good about covering up that damage. So if it's early enough in the stage of the soybeans, which it is right now, at least here in north central Kansas. The soybeans are at that vegetative stage where they can regenerate leaf tissue pretty quickly, but they still are a cause for concern because they're relatively large, showy beetle, and they'll feed on the leaves, and the growers get concerned about it. Thing is, they're mostly on the side of the field, whether it's a cornfield or a soybean field, that they were produced from. By that I mean the adults are out feeding, and they're going to feed for 3 or 4 days voraciously. They feed a lot because they're going to get enough nutrition so that they can mate and lay eggs, and then they're going to leave and disperse from those soybean or cornfields, and they're going to go someplace and lay eggs. They lay eggs in some perennial, like a turf farm or grapes, or someplace where the grubs, because that's what the larval stage is of the Japanese beetle, the grubs can feed on the root system. That's why they won't lay eggs in the soybean field or the cornfield, or if they do, they won't develop into a grub. That first wave will feed for 3 or 4 days, then they'll disperse and go lay eggs. If you can withstand that without spraying, you're probably not going to have to worry about it, because after that, they'll lay eggs for a few days. They'll come back and eat again, but a lot of times, the silks have turned brown by then, or they've passed the stage where they're attractive to the beetles feeding, so they'll go feed on something else. And adult Japanese beetle will feed on anything. They'll feed on mulberries, pears, apples, just anything that's out there. If you are considering treating, you might make sure you scout the whole field or sample the whole field, because you might get away with just treating that one side of the field or one half of the field relative to where the grubs are being produced.
How does this species get controlled?
But it's all about timing. Remember, anytime we're trying to control any pest, it's all about timing. So if you notice Japanese beetles are flying to your field, like I said, get out and sample. Make sure it's justifying the treatment. And if it is a cornfield, we say if the beetles are feeding enough to keep the silks broomed back to within a half an inch or less of the husk, you might consider spraying or consider treating, because there may not be enough silk there to accept the pollen. But if it's already pollinated, it doesn't matter. Those silks are not being used anyway. So I really have a hard time recommending treating for desilking of corn, whether it's rootworms or Japanese beetles or whatever, because we've done a lot of research on that over the years, and it takes a lot of feeding for 3 or 4 days, 24/7, to keep those silks down where they don't actually catch up little pollen grain. Those plants are putting out millions or billions of pollen grains, and they're very good at catching them or accepting them for pollination. So the same with soybeans. If you're out in soybean fields, make sure they're defoliating enough, 50 to 60% of the plant, not one leaf, but the whole plant throughout a good portion of the field. That might justify treating. But remember, they're only going to be out there feeding at that stage and that rate for probably 2 or 3 days, and then all these adults are going to take off and go lay eggs. So it won't exactly cure the problem, but it will naturally relieve the problem. The soybean plant, if it has good moisture, can probably overcome the leaf feeding at that time.
And a bug now maybe that aren't as likely to see in your field, however, maybe more in your home or in your shed, brown recluse spiders.
Gotten several calls lately about brown recluse spiders. We've done quite a bit of research over the years. How do you control brown recluses? Some pest control operators say spray your house and that will take care of them. Some pest control operators say put out sticky traps and that will take care of them. They both work. But if you use them in combination and you wait a little bit, you'll get a better control. We have 2 venomous spiders in Kansas. When I say venomous, I mean that are venomous to people and pets, domestic animals, okay? All spiders are venomous. The brown recluse spider, we found, is not very aggressive. They are hunters. They may build a little bit of a web, but they actually leave when they're hungry, and they go searching for their prey, so they're crawling out and around. And the best place to run into a brown recluse spider is in some place where you're storing something. That's an ideal situation for the brown recluse spider. So the brown recluse is active from March through September. From October through February or early March, they're inactive. They're just in hibernation. So right now, if you have a shed that you're getting some new equipment out of, be really careful. That's where the brown recluse spiders are. The best way to manage spiders and the best way to manage any household pest get rid of the clutter. I mean, if you have a whole bunch of cardboard you want to keep, smash it up in smaller pieces, flat pieces, store it someplace, because we found old barns and sheds with pallets or cardboard or leather, like saddles and horse blankets and all that kind of stuff. Man, you can collect hundreds of brown recluse spiders. So if you want to manage in the first place to start, clean it up. Get rid of everything you do not need to store and tidy up the storage area. Then if you spray, if you have a commercial applicator, pest control operator spray, or if you get a pesticide and spray all around, spray it really good, and then put out sticky traps. The sprays, they're going to kill the food source for the brown recluse spiders. Now, the brown recluse is a cannibal also, so eventually, once they don't have any more crickets or roly-polies to eat, they'll start eating each other. So it takes a while, but you spray it, you put down sticky traps, clean out the sticky traps about every 2 weeks. That will give you an idea if the population is going up or down. One thing of caution, when you grab a sticky trap, the spiders aren't going to be dead. Their feet are stuck to them, their legs. Lots of times, if you pick them up, that leg will break off and the thing will fall out or jump out on you. So just when you pick up a sticky trap, be very careful. Replace it with a clean one. That'll give you an idea of how the population is doing. But brown recluse spiders can be managed. You can get rid of them, but you really have to kind of have that as your goal, and you have to be conscientious to get rid of them, because they lay eggs a couple times a year, and those eggs can hatch in 40, 50 little babies, and those babies scatter out. It just takes a while to get rid of them. So they are a lot more common than people think. And in my opinion, from collecting spiders in the last 10 years, 15 years, I think they are our most common household spider in Kansas. It's just they are reclusive, so folks don't really realize they're there. But they have a very characteristic exoskeleton. As they shed their skin, that shed has a very characteristic shape by the way they hook on to crawl out of their skin. So even if you don't see them, if you see the shed skin, you can tell immediately if they're a brown recluse or not. So one other thing, if you get bitten by a brown recluse, everybody reacts differently to the venom or the protein injected into your skin. The brown recluse affects the red blood cells. So if you get bitten by a brown recluse, it's generally a little bloodier situation. Like I said, they affect the red blood cells, so they can keep bleeding, kind of keep ulcerous for quite a while. If you do get bitten, go to the doctor, tell them there are some medicines they can help treat with. Generally speaking, the bite's going to be kind of a bloody mess for a little while, but it probably won't do anything after that. And I've been bitten once by one, so I'm still here.
That was K-State Extension crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Most consumers expect the retail price for a gallon of homogenized milk in Kansas City, Denver, St. Louis, and Oklahoma City to be relatively the same. However, data from the Milk Market Administrator Office in Kansas City shows that's not always the case. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk takes a closer look at the findings from 2022 and the variation in price for both consumers and producers within the region.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the price of retail milk in grocery stores in the region. You know, as we look around the region, there are some differences in what fluid milk costs when people go to the grocery store. The Milk Market Administrator's Office in Kansas City does a wonderful job of summarizing this data once a year, and they've been collecting data on the retail prices versus what the average price is received for Class 1 on the farm for over 20 years now. So as we look at the data that they recently published, and they collect data twice a month, about the 1st of the month and about the 10th of the month, in 4 different locations in our region: Denver, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Oklahoma City. They survey the 2 largest grocery chains in the trade area, as well as the largest convenience store operator. And they look at what the price of homogenized milk is leaving those retail locations. This is all summarized, again, 2 data points each month. And as we look at the data, it is interesting. When we look at the average prices paid for homogenized milk in Denver, for example, it was up in 2022, just a little over $3 a gallon. When you look at the cost in Kansas City was actually a little over $4 a gallon. Oklahoma City in 2022 averaged just under $2.50 a gallon, and St. Louis about $2.60 a gallon. So there's differences in retail prices, and some might wonder, is that associated with the price of the raw milk going into the product? Well, if you look at the Class 1 prices for each of those months in different locations, which is how the Milk Market Administrator's Office looks at it, it's kind of interesting. Actually, the lowest price paid for milk in 2022, the raw milk going into the processing plant, was actually in the Kansas City area. And the highest priced milk for raw milk was in the other three locations. Actually, they were fairly similar in what the cost of the raw milk going into the finished product was. Now, these costs don't necessarily always reflect the total cost that a processor would assume as they produce milk. It also doesn't account for the variation that we have from state to state as to how milk can be utilized as a low-cost leader in the grocery store chains. So as you look at some of these prices and you look at some of the variation, you've got to keep in mind that there are state regulations that come into play, and these vary by state and are not the same across the board since they're set by each state that they're looking at. So in the 4 different locations that the Milk Market Administrator looks at, there are differences in state rules that affect the price that stores can charge for homogenized milk. So as you visit with your friends that might live in, say, the Kansas City area versus someone that might live in Oklahoma or even over in St. Louis, there may be differences in the prices that they say they're paying for milk in the store. This usually isn't necessarily associated with the price that the farmer's getting paid on the farm for the raw milk when we look at Class 1 prices. It is associated with other things and other rules and regulations that regulate how we price milk in different states. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. The Central Marketing Area is one of 11 regional federal milk marketing orders in the U.S. The mission is to facilitate the efficient marketing of milk and dairy products. For more information, visit fmmacentral.com. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Whitworth. This is the K-State Radio Network.